video 5 for Unit 1, Biological Basis of Behavior. This video will be focusing on the structures and functions of the brain. By the end of this video, you should be able to answer the following question. How do the structures and functions of the brain apply to behavior and mental processes? Now, to start, I want to make it very clear that you are not going to be required to locate any of these structures on a diagram. So you will never be asked to point out which part of the brain is an arrow pointing to. However, the location of the structures sometimes gives us some information about what that structure might do in order for us to have a good understanding of the functions of the brain. So we are going to go through the different structures one by one. I want to show you this image that we're looking at right now with our brain. So if you didn't know, our brain is made up of two hemispheres connected at the bottom by the spinal cord and the brainstem. The two hemispheres are connected in the middle by some fibers. So the image that we're looking at right now is as if we are taking one hemisphere off and we're looking at the inside of one of the hemispheres. So most of the structures that we're going to be talking about, with the exception of the brainstem and the cerebellum, are going to be repeated in the other hemisphere. So most of these structures, there will be two, one on the left hemisphere, one on the right. Before we get into the different structures of the brain, we do need to talk about the spinal cord. The spinal cord is an important part of the central nervous system. The spinal cord is where our interneurons are held, and they are the messenger between the peripheral nervous system and the brain. The first three structures we're going to talk about are part of the brainstem. This is the oldest part of our brain. So this is the very first thing that will develop in the womb. And there are three structures that make up the brainstem. The first is the medulla oblongata, often just referred to as the medulla. The medulla is going to control vital processes like breathing, heartbeat, and blood pressure. In addition, the medulla is going to be the major relay center for the sensory information from the periphery. The next structure is the reticular formation. You will sometimes see this referred to as the reticular activating system. And this structure is in charge of arousal and consciousness. So I don't mean sexual arousal, I mean like making you alert, helping you wake up every single morning. So the reticular formation is allowing you to be conscious and awake and alert and able to function. If you have damage to the reticular formation, you would not be able to wake up. You would be unconscious. The next structure is the pons. The pons controls our sleep cycle, it manages our pain signals, and it's the major connection point to our cerebellum. All three of these structures make up our brainstem. The next structure that we're going to talk about is the cerebellum. It's often referred to as the little brain, and that's because it looks like a miniature version of the whole brain. It's located in the back of our head, and it's the second thing that's going to develop after our brainstem in the womb. The cerebellum's major function is that it controls our balance and the coordination of other movements. The next two structures we've already talked about in a previous video, but I'm going to talk about them again. The pituitary gland is our major gland for our endocrine system. Again, it's going to tell all of the other endocrine system glands to function and secrete hormones. Our hypothalamus is the brain structure that controls the pituitary gland. So it's going to tell the pituitary gland to fire. In addition to controlling the endocrine system, the hypothalamus also controls innate drives like hunger and thirst. So the hypothalamus has two parts, the ventromedial hypothalamus and the lateral hypothalamus. The lateral hypothalamus controls our ability to feel hunger. So if the lateral hypothalamus was damaged, someone would never have the thought that they are hungry. They might still have the physical symptoms of being hungry, like your stomach growling or feeling weak, but their brain will never tell them that they need to eat. The other part of the hypothalamus is the ventromedial hypothalamus. And this is the part of the hypothalamus that controls our ability to feel full. So if someone's ventromedial hypothalamus is damaged, the person would never feel full. And I keep this in mind by thinking of the V for vomit. So if the ventromedial hypothalamus is damaged, the person would never feel full and they'd eat to the point of vomiting. The next structure is the hippocampus. The hippocampus is super important for memory, learning, and spatial navigation. The major thing we're going to talk about with the hippocampus over the course of this year is that the hippocampus is the structure in our brain that allows us to create new memories. The next structure is the thalamus. It sits right on top of the hypothalamus, and the thalamus is our sensory control center. So when sensory information comes into our body, let's say it's visual information comes into our body through our eyes, it first goes to the thalamus. The thalamus will then determine, okay, this is visual information, and send it to the part of the brain that processes visual information. So the thalamus doesn't necessarily make sense of what that vision is. It's just saying this needs to go to the visual part of the brain so that part of the brain can process it. The amygdala is next, and the amygdala is the structure responsible for managing our basic emotions, specifically anger and fear. The amygdala is going to be the reason for our fight or flight response to be activated. The next structure is the corpus callosum, and the corpus callosum are those fibers that connect the two hemispheres together. The major function of the corpus callosum is to allow messages to be sent from our left hemisphere to our right hemisphere. So it is the connector point, the bridge between the two hemispheres. Finally, we have our cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is what most people think of when they think of a brain, and it is the wrinkly outer part of the brain. The cerebral cortex is where all higher order thinking and processes happen. Things like making sense of visual information, judgment and impulse control, making sense of other sensory information. So the cerebral cortex is kind of like the processor. It's doing all of the things that we have to work a little bit harder to do. Now, I want to go a little bit more in depth on structures that make up what we call the limbic system. The limbic system is where we process and regulate emotion and memory while also dealing with sexual stimulation and learning. The structures that make up the limbic system are the hippocampus, which primarily is memory, the thalamus, which again is our sensory control center, our hypothalamus, which deals with those innate drives like hunger and thirst, our amygdala, which deals with fear and anger, those basic emotions, and finally, our pituitary gland, which is the connection, the major gland of our endocrine system. Let's look a little bit closer at the cerebral cortex. A reminder, we said that the cerebral cortex does all higher order thinking. We can separate the cerebral cortex into 4 lobes. Again, we have 2 hemispheres. So we are looking at the side of a brain. So we have to imagine that these lobes are going to be in both hemispheres. So we are going to have a frontal lobe on both the right side of our cerebral cortex as well as the left. So we're going to start from the front and work our way back. Our frontal lobe is made up of 3 different structures: the prefrontal cortex, the motor cortex, and Broca's area. The prefrontal cortex is right behind our forehead. It is the very last portion of our brain to develop. In fact, it doesn't develop until you're about 25 or 26. The prefrontal cortex is going to control things like judgment, decision-making, and impulse control. So you heard that right. You are sitting here right now watching this video, and this part of your brain is not developed yet. The next part of our frontal lobe is the motor cortex. The motor cortex is going to control all voluntary movements. The motor cortex can be mapped, and different parts of our body are controlled by different parts of the motor cortex. The final part of the frontal lobe I want to talk about is Broca's area. Broca's area is located in only the left hemisphere, and it is located at the very back and bottom of the frontal lobe. Broca's area is a special part of the brain called an association area, and it is responsible for controlling the formation of speech. This kind of makes sense that it's here because our motor cortex controls all of our voluntary body movements. So if we're controlling the ability to speak, those would be voluntary movements. The next lobe that we want to talk about is the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe sits right on top of our head. It has a part of the lobe directly behind the motor cortex called the somatosensory cortex. The somatosensory cortex is going to be our bodily senses, so things like touch and pain. So again, just like the motor cortex, you can map the somatosensory cortex, and different parts of our body are processed in different parts of the somatosensory cortex. So if I were to go in and touch a part of your somatosensory cortex, it would feel in your body like a specific part of your body is being touched. The next part of our cerebral cortex we're going to talk about is the temporal lobe, and that is right here behind your temples. So the temporal lobe is going to have two specific areas that we need to talk about. The first is the auditory cortex. The temporal lobe is right behind your ears, and so this is going to be the part of the brain that is going to process any auditory information that comes in. So you can hear me speaking and understand what I am saying because of the auditory cortex. One specific part of the auditory cortex is called Wernicke's area or Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area allows the comprehension of speech. Again, this makes sense because our auditory cortex is there. This is an area of that cortex that allows us to understand what someone is saying. Finally, at the very back of our brain is the occipital lobe, and the occipital lobe has one particular job. It contains the visual cortex, and so much like the auditory cortex for hearing, the visual cortex is going to process any visual information that comes into our brain. So let's talk a little bit more about the brain's hemispheres. We talked about how the brain has two hemispheres that are connected by the corpus callosum. And the corpus callosum allows the two hemispheres to talk or communicate with each other. Now, our hemispheres have what are called contralateral hemispheric organization. And this is a really, really fancy way of saying that our left hemisphere controls the right side of our body, and our right hemisphere controls the left side of our body. So everything is crisscrossed. In addition, each of the hemispheres have specialized functions as well. The left hemisphere deals with language and logic. So that is why Broca's area and Wernicke's area only exist in the left hemisphere, because our left hemisphere focuses on that language. In addition, it does logical things like arithmetic and grammar rules and reading and writing. Our right hemisphere does things like spatial awareness, facial recognition, our emotional tone of the speech, its geometric patterns, and music. Now, one of the things that's important to know is that our brain has what is called neuroplasticity or brain plasticity. And this is the idea that other structures will compensate for a damaged structure. So for example, if you get in an accident and you bruise your left frontal lobe, the right frontal lobe might pick up the slack and do a little bit of the functions that the left frontal lobe would do in order to allow you to function normally in everyday life. In very extreme cases of damage, for example, there was a girl who had a seizure disorder and had one of her entire hemispheres removed. Our brain has what is called neurogenesis, and this is the actual recreation of neural tissue over time. So the young girl had one hemisphere removed, and over time, you could see that the brain created more and more neural tissue to make up for the neural tissue that was lost. It's not just tissue, however. If specific neurons or nerves are damaged, those neurons can create new connections with other neurons in the brain in order to allow for proper functioning.